Mrs. Jane Sharp published a Midwives Book in 1671 during the reign of Charles II, and it was a serious instructional text, so it makes total sense that early on she expresses this intention to be modest and respectable when discussing midwifery and reproduction. After all, she wants people to respect her expertise. She doesn't want them to have a childish giggle every time sex is mentioned. Her descriptions of how the male and female reproductive systems work are highly detailed, so I am fairly sure that she was or had been married at the time when she published her book. But besides that, she also discusses an awful lot of other things relating to day-to-day life in Restoration England, and they're worth exploring. Historically, we perceive that women were largely dominated by men. Men had rights that women didn't. Women could not refuse to have sex with their husbands. Girls were educated at home, if they were educated at all. Catholics, working class men and, of course, women were just three of the social groups who could not vote. Society was not at all equal. So Jane Sharp's view of the world is quite radical. Initially, I thought that perhaps she could have been illiterate and had dictated her work to a scribe in order to get published. But when you read the Midwives Book and you see Jane reminding her readers that whatever social and political power men have got, the man can do nothing without the woman to beget children, I think she wrote that herself. A ghostwriter would not have made such a feminist statement. Further on, she makes a passing reference to married couples continuing to have sex even when the woman is pregnant. I think our Victorian and Edwardian ancestors would have been appalled by that, but Jane is far more realistic. After all, if we suppose that the average 17th century working class person was free to marry who they like, and they did, then it's only logical that they found somebody they loved and found attractive, and why is pregnancy going to change that? It isn't. Page 128, there's a rather telling comment as well. Jane is very cynical about whether or not it is possible for Catholic monks and nuns to be celibate. Again, I think she's just realistic about the fact that everybody has sexual desires, feels sexual attraction to somebody, and so naturally she is questioning whether it is reasonable to expect them to adopt a celibate life. It also makes me think she wasn't Catholic. So that nicely leads me on to the biblical references that you can find all through the Midwives Book. It's quite understandable when you think that by law you were expected to attend Anglican church at least once a month, and if you didn't you would be fined for recusancy. £60 was a lot of money in our modern terms. Church was central to basically everybody's life. Jane is not overly religious in her text. However, on page 91, when she mentions our Saviour, I think we all know who she's talking about. And I'm fairly sure that her Christian readers would certainly have known, as she reminds them on page 51, that polygamy is forbidden by the laws of God. Further on, she also quotes the guidelines in the book of Leviticus to suggest that a new mother should be confined for varying lengths of time after childbirth, depending on whether she's had a son or a daughter. But she doesn't just take this at face value, she actually then compares it to some advice from Hippocrates, the ancient Greek physician. So she's weighing up information from all different sources. She seems to be quite widely read. A curious belief in the 17th century was that men had hotter blood than women, and in the Midwives Book, Jane Sharp uses this theory to explain that this is why women have their reproductive organs on the inside of their body. It's simply to keep them warmer. And she also makes this fascinating point about the structure of the male and female reproductive systems, pointing out that effectively they are mirror images of each other. And she's got a point. Her anatomical knowledge is really quite good. She knows enough to dismiss a theory by a 13th century Italian anatomist that the uterus is divided into 7 different cells, which is why multiple births are possible. Jane Sharps actually comments that none that ever saw the womb can think so, for there is but one hollow place. So totally dismisses this theory. But that is a starting point to explore something else that she might have known about. Page 61, she compares the womb to a pear in shape. How does she know that? On page 103, she comments that Galen never saw a woman anatomised. So is she saying that she has seen somebody being anatomised? She's seen an autopsy, a dissection. She never explicitly tells us. My feeling is that if she hadn't observed one, she knew somebody who had, and she had got information from them. The Midwives Book is not a diary. It wasn't written for that purpose. It's an instructional medical text. But even so, there are all sorts of clues about everyday life in the 1670s. On one page, Jane describes something as being as big as a penny loaf. So that tells you, without having to be a food historian or an economic historian, what the typical price of a loaf of bread was, and that it's a staple food that everybody would recognise. There are all sorts of other references to food and drink. Sheep's milk, almond milk, barley water, cinnamon water, mint water. We've got beer, ale, sage ale, garden tansy ale. A lot of wine. White wine, Malago wine, claret, caudle, aleberries. Nourishing broths, chicken broth, strong broth. White bread toast. Oatmeal, new laid eggs, soft boiled eggs, poached eggs. Chicken, pullet, veal, capon, watery fish. Lettuce, endives, pear, sour apples, sour cherries, green fruit, rhubarb, roast apples, fine sugar, quince and medlar marmalade. So we've got a really good idea of the kind of things that were on the dinner table or in the kitchen cupboard in the 1670s. If this book is typical of its time, 17th century medicine was apparently far more like what we'd call alternative therapies than our modern pharmaceutical approach to drugs and medicines. Jane's recipes call for all sorts of plants and herbs, but she doesn't explain to you how to tell sage from parsley, how to know your marshmallows from your marigolds, because she doesn't need to. The average person in the 17th century probably grew these plants in their garden. They probably knew what to go and pick if they got a headache or general aches and pains or the flu. They would easily recognise what the plants were and how you use them. But more unusual ingredients, like the exotic dragon's blood, might call for a trip to the local apothecary, just like we call into the chemist for something today. On page 139, she suggests garden tansy ale as a remedy against miscarriage, kind of preventative. But tansy is an odd ingredient. It seems to have been used for many sorts of gynecological issues. Confusingly, it could not only prevent miscarriage, but it could also induce abortion and encourage conception, so it seemed to be an all-rounder, really. The 1920s book I found in our downstairs bookcase advised against many things during childbirth, immediately afterwards, and also during your period, including washing your hair and bathing. Well, Jane Sharp would have totally disagreed with this in the 1670s. Jane believes that bathing can be very beneficial in late pregnancy and immediately after childbirth. She suggests adding a handful each of betony, or also mallow, mugwort, marjoram, mint, chamomile, linseed and pursley, which I think might actually be purslane. So why is she recommending these ingredients? Let's have a look. One thing you can say for her is that she certainly knows her herbs. This is the 17th century equivalent of a bottle of Radox. To keep the herbs from getting all over the place in the bath, she sensibly suggests that maybe you could make little cloth bags for them and tie them up so they don't get loose everywhere. And I think the overall effect would have been that you end up with a kind of giant tea bag for the bath, which again would infuse just like a tea bag does today in hot water. It's often said that we are what we eat, and I think Jane Sharp would have agreed with this philosophy, but her take on it is probably a little bit different to the way we interpret that phrase. On page 133, she cautions that if you eat chestnuts, quinces, pears and medlars, you risk making the birth canal narrower and therefore childbirth will be more difficult. So that's something to watch out for. I don't know whether there is any scientific evidence to back this up. I certainly can't find any suggestions to confirm this other than the fact that she mentions it in the Midwives Book. It may just be her personal opinion. Page 232, she also advises that the womb and therefore the woman's body should be kept at a nice constant temperature, which sounds a little bit strange, but if the womb is too hot, there is a solution for this. Wear thin clothes, eat lettuce, endives and any herbs deemed to be cooling. Logical. And if the womb has become too cold, you could try a poultice made with clove and nutmeg oils and also some frankincense. Of course, these are still quite popular additions to our Christmas and festive scented candles that you can buy in the shops today, creating that nice mulled wine and gingerbread sort of fragrance. They probably would be warming. I think that if we were to be transported back through time and we landed in her 1670s Britain, some of the things we'd experience would be familiar to us, but other things such as our lack of individual rights, freedom to practice the faith of your choice, even the chance to pursue education, would be quite alien to us. I think we would struggle to get used to that. The world changes, of course it changes, and they're just a few examples of how life was very, very different back then. In my next video, I'm going to explore Jane's approach to childbirth to see whether we can understand the instructions and the guidelines that she's giving, the arrangements that she suggests, and also to see whether we can actually understand the language that was used in her book 350 years after it was published. So I hope to see you when that video is ready to go. Thank you for watching.